everybody. Welcome to the Jimmy Mathis Show. We have got an absolute jam-packed show for you tonight, diving into President Biden's overseas trip, the ramifications that are already coming out from that. Also, I've been wanting to do this for the last 2 weeks. We're going to spend a little bit of time right now talk about something that is very significant, which is this Iranian nuclear deal. If you followed me back on my radio days, in 2015, the U.S. struck sort of the original version of what we are now continuing. There are a lot of similarities with one constant, which is this is bad for America. Not only do the American people have no real say into this, neither does the United States Congress. So we're going to peel the onion back on that a little bit. Also, Bryan Sears, political reporter from the Daily Record, will be joining us in our last segment. Sine die, the end of legislative session 2022. We'll be wrapping up in just a little over 2 weeks, April 11th. Bryan Sears breaking down what is going on in Annapolis. But first of all, I do want to talk about the Iranian nuclear deal. This started really back in 2015. This, by all reasonable reasoning, should have been a treaty. This was an agreement, as President then Barack Obama had classified it. Words mean things, ladies and gentlemen. If this were to be a treaty, which is what it was, the United States Congress would have needed to ratify it, which they wouldn't. The treaty provision at the time was flipped on its head, and this was not called a treaty. It was called an agreement. It was an agreement that the way it was being sold to the American people, at least the very few times that the American people were even aware of it, was that this was a plan that was going to delay or possibly keep Iran from getting the bomb. Not for 1 second did I believe that. I believed, if anything, this was actually a fast track to Iran getting the bomb. The key components of this were that the centrifuges were still spinning, meaning that Iran was making uranium one step closer to them acquiring an atomic weapon. Fast forward 7 years later, with everything going on in Ukraine, and when nuclear weapons are top of mind for everybody, what is happening in Iran? They are now accelerating the original Iranian nuclear deal, for lack of a better term, back in 2015, to ramp up production, to make Iran more dangerous. And what country is fronting this? You got it. Russia. Again, the same logic that was being used back in 2015 is being used again today, which is this is not a treaty, which, again, it is, but it can't be classified as such because, the same as in 2015, there is no way that then President Barack Obama would have gotten 2/3 of the Congress to ratify it. Never would have happened. Instead, it became an agreement that then Biden would have had to have vetoed, which, of course, he wouldn't do. We have Ben Cardin, by the way, along with Senator Corker, that basically annihilated, torpedoed the treaty provision. Again, fast forward, Congress right now has no idea exactly what is in this thing, the same way they didn't back in 2015. The one thing we do know is, just as it was back in 2015, Iran is ramping up the rhetoric. Death to Israel, death to America. Back in 2015, you may remember, while the deal was being negotiated, Iran had commandeered a U.S. Navy ship. They had taken American soldiers hostage under the Obama administration at gunpoint. This was while we were negotiating the deal. Fast forward 7 years, Russia is now negotiating the deal. I think we could all agree, whatever side of the political divide you may be, Russia is not being a real good player on the world stage. Can we agree on that? Not only is Russia negotiating this monstrosity of a deal, part of what is in this deal, keep in mind, Iran will be ramping up its uranium production to the point that they will have leftover uranium. Obviously, uranium is a key component to making a nuclear weapon. Guess who gets to purchase that leftover uranium? Russia. The rhetoric out of Iran, again, death to Israel, death to America, while we're negotiating the deal for take two. Only it gets worse. Now they're also launching rockets at American consulates while we're negotiating the deal. One of the sticking points on this, and this is very important, is that Iran is classified as a terrorist state. It's an official terrorist state, same as it was back in 2015. I remember like it was yesterday, John Kerry, then Secretary of State, was asked the question, Will some of this money, the money being the roughly $200 billion that we gave Iran in cash as part of the agreement, question from then Secretary of State was, will some of this money go to fund terrorist activities? Keeping in mind, because Iran is technically a terrorist state. That's who we were negotiating with. There really is no ambiguity in that. Now, the argument could have been made, and it was made on the left, that at the very least, maybe this would prolong Iran getting the bomb. I didn't believe for 1 second it would do that in any meaningful way, and today is proof that it didn't. Now, this deal, the 2022 version, is to further accelerate it. But while we were negotiating that agreement back in 2015, again, then Secretary of State John Kerry was asked the question, will some of this money that we're giving the Iranians, will it go to fund terrorist activity? Seems like a reasonable question. And the answer that John Kerry gave was almost dismissive in nature of course it will. Why wouldn't it? They are a terrorist organization. We're giving a terrorist organization crates, pallets of money. They're going to do terrorist things. That's what terrorist organizations do. Reasonable Americans would then ask the question, why are we giving a terrorist state all of this money? To which I still have not heard a reasonable explanation. Keep in mind, ever since the horrific attacks on our country back on September 11th, 2001, this country has been voluntarily giving up civil liberties at every single turn. Why? For security. As Benjamin Franklin so astutely once said, when you give up liberty in the name of security, you deserve and shall receive neither. Again, Americans have consciously and voluntarily made that decision. Why? To be safer. Which then really begs the question why our government would be giving hundreds of billions of dollars to a terrorist state. And now the sticking point of the second version of this agreement is whether or not Iran will continue to be labeled a terrorist state. And you listen to those on the left and they laugh about it. They go, this is semantics. It really doesn't matter. We're already implementing sanctions on Iran the same way we are on Russia. And other than the hurt that it's bringing the Russian people, has it slowed Putin's role at all? The answer is unequivocally no. He has become more emboldened, and we'll get to what's happening in Ukraine shortly. Same way the sanctions in Iran did not slow their nuclear production. And now America is acting almost as an ally to a described terrorist state. It's getting little coverage right now. It got next to no coverage back in 2015. Obviously, all eyes around the globe are focused on what is happening in Ukraine. And understandably, I totally understand that. But keep in mind that the narrative, the rhetoric that we're hearing out of Ukraine right now is that we can have no meaningful response to Russia's aggression for one simple reason, and that is that they are a nuclear power. Everybody is worried, forget sanctions for a second, but that if we were to militarily actively engage Putin, this would automatically result in nuclear escalation or chemical escalation, which Putin has made clear he's more than willing to go down that road, the same way he did in Syria, in Aleppo, when he used chemical weapons on the civilians of Aleppo. So what are we talking about right now, ladies and gentlemen? We're talking about a terrorist state that as of now, at least to our knowledge, does not have a nuclear weapon. And this agreement that Russia, of all people, is pointing is to get Iran one step closer to acquiring a nuclear weapon, which means once they do, we can have no recourse for the same reasons we have none right now when it comes to Russia. Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, was questioned about this last week. I normally don't like to let sound bites play for 2 minutes, but I'm going to let this one because all the key points are hit. And I want you to listen very closely to the way Ms. Psaki responds.
The president called Putin a war criminal yesterday. The Secretary of State just said that that was also his view today. So given all of that, why are we still having Putin's Russia broker the Iran nuclear deal talks?
Well, I would say that it's not in our interest for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and Russia is a member of the P5+1. So that is pursuit of a deal that would be in our national security interests.
So basically, we're just stuck working with him.
Well, again, I think how the president and any of the P5+1 partners or Europeans or others look at this is if we can achieve a diplomatic solution where we prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, despite the efforts by former President Trump to pull us out of the deal, allowing Iran to move closer to acquiring a nuclear weapon, that would be good for our national security and good for global security around the world.
The Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act says that Congress is required to review any new agreement. This is obviously not the same agreement that Obama worked on in 2015. Does President Biden believe that this treaty needs the advice and consent of Congress? And if so, does he believe he has the votes to lawfully affirm it?
Well, if and when we have a deal, and we don't have a deal at this point, otherwise you would all know, we would carefully consider the facts and circumstances of any U.S. return to the JCPOA to determine the legal implications, including those under the Iran Nuclear Review Act of 2015. And we're committed to ensuring the requirements are satisfied. So certainly we would abide by that. But we have been keeping members very updated. We've been briefing them regularly. Brett McGurk conducted a call just a couple of days ago, and we've been briefing them with a range of national security officials.
And then has the IGRC, or done anything, or rather the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has it done anything to be eligible to be removed from the terror blacklist?
Well, I think you're asking me this because it's been out there as a possible discussion, but there's no deal at this point. So if and when there's a deal, we'll have a discussion about what's in the deal.
Outside of the deal, though, does it take action to be removed from that terror blacklist? Do you have to do something to get off of it?
You have to make a decision, yes. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. I want to ask you a slightly different.
All right, so a rope-a-dope that would have made Muhammad Ali proud. First of all, let's cover on some key points. Number one, advise and consent, which is a fundamental responsibility of the United States Congress. You can't advise and consent after the point, or it becomes pointless. The whole advising thing is to get you to a treaty, which they're not technically calling it. Why? Because then you would need 2/3 of the Congress to ratify it, which they won't. You also saw a bold-faced lie from Jen Psaki, which said she is keeping, or the White House is keeping Congress advised, is keeping them in the loop on what is going on with this agreement. Kevin McCarthy came out last week and said, we haven't heard anything about this. Nothing about this. Ms. Psaki talks about diplomacy. Are you out of your mind? The same reason why diplomacy isn't working with Russia right now is the same reason why it's not going to work with the Iranians. Same reason it didn't work back in 2015. And now all of a sudden, this continuation of a bad deal, which is what it is another bad deal to ramp up a previous bad deal, removing Congress, removing advise and consent, removing needing Congress to ratify the treaty, because we're not calling that with 2/3 of senators present. So now the White House will come up with another brainchild, just like they did in 2015, that will not remove Iran off the terrorist watch list, which will not only have them ramping up uranium production, but so much of it that they have it left over that then they're going to funnel to Russia, who we can't have any meaningful recourse with because they already have atomic weapons. And you're getting little coverage of this in the mainstream press, the same way you got very little coverage of it back in 2015. And again, it's dismissive the way the White House is approaching this. But when we have a deal, we'll let you know what's in the deal. And what the reporter is asking is, shouldn't Congress be involved in constructing the deal? Now, when the deal's done, we'll let you know what the deal is. And Congress is going, okay, so we get to ratify? No, of course not, because it's not a treaty. We'll just let you know what we have, I would say, unilaterally negotiated, but it's not unilateral because we have Russia negotiating it on America's behalf with a state terror organization that comes out and publicly goes, death to Israel, death to America. I guess they're good players right now when you compare to the way they acted back in 2015. At least they're not commandeering U.S. Navy ships. This is absurd. Meanwhile, while we have President Joe Biden overseas, why I still have no idea. Things in Ukraine right now, look, so much respect and admiration for President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people that are defending their homeland and have done a much better job than anybody had thought that they would. And however this thing ends when it's said and done, one thing that the Ukrainian people have proven time and time again is Putin will not change hearts and minds in Ukraine. He may bomb that poor country into oblivion, but he won't change hearts and minds. I don't understand what the purpose was of Joe Biden going overseas. I'm reading all the main sites before I go on the air, and the analysis, if you will, from that trip was that Biden has angered Putin. We're into month number 2 of this war, and all I hear from our government is make sure that you don't make this rabid dog any more angry than they already are. And here's the problem with this. This whole thing's beginning to remind me an awful lot like the COVID pandemic, where all of a sudden the actions that America takes, they don't even resemble reality. There is no logical course to follow. Stand up, sit down, wear a mask. You can't have more than 4 people in the place. You got to close at 10. You need the shot. Well, the shot doesn't really prevent it, but at least you won't die. Well, you make... At some point, you kind of just lose hope in the process. And that's where I'm at right now with America's involvement on this Russian invasion. I can understand why nobody wants to implement a no-fly zone. On the surface, it sounds like a good idea. The problem, like we talked about last week, is if you're going to have a no-fly zone, that means you need to enforce a no-fly zone, which in turn means when somebody flies through your no-fly zone, you need to shoot that airplane down, and somehow that automatically escalates this thing into World War III, which I think most reasonable minds can agree that we're already there. We're not going to win Putin through with diplomacy. The same reason, which is what Psaki was asked, we're not going to win the Iranians over with diplomacy. Putin knows one thing and one thing only, and that's force, whether it's levied against him or he's levying it against somebody else. But I'll go ahead and play along for a second. If the narrative here is, and what we've heard out of Washington constantly is, we don't want to escalate this situation with Putin, with America directly. Not only are we giving the Ukrainians a ton of money for humanitarian relief, which I think most Americans don't have a problem with, we are giving them some weapons. We're giving them Stinger missiles. We gave them Javelin missiles that are the anti-tank missiles. The Ukrainians are asking for Harpoon weapons, which would take out the ships. The Ukrainians actually got 2 ships off of Crimea. If the whole point here is not to anger Putin, what would anger him more? Giving Javelin missiles that will take out tanks or an F-18? You can't have it both ways, and that's the problem right now. And listen, I understand there is a lot going on behind closed doors that eventually, when the history books are written, we'll understand what's going on. Something is just not making sense here. But what really doesn't make sense is that when we cannot engage in this conflict, which, by the way, does have geopolitical ramifications for it. I know America doesn't want to think that this war in Ukraine has anything to do with America, but make no mistake about it, it absolutely does. And a destabilized world is not good for the world's superpower, which is America. And I promise you, whatever your thoughts may be on America's response to what is going on in Ukraine, allowing Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon is not good for America. It's definitely not good for Israel, which is a huge ally of ours. And when, again, the words coming from Iran is death to America and death to Israel, maybe you should just listen. President Joe Biden oversees one flub after another. He really should be back in Washington hiding his own Easter eggs for a couple weeks coming up here. There was one part, and again, if I was going to play every misstep by the president, we would be here all night. But there was something that I heard live last Thursday, I believe, that really stuck with me. Mr. President, go.
We're a unique country in many ways, and we're the only country in the world not organized based on geography or ethnicity or religion or race or anything else. We're based on an idea. Literally the only country in the world based on an idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all women and men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Sounds corny, but it's the truth of who we are. We've never lived up to it, but we've never walked.
I'll tell you, he really is just like his predecessor. He really is. If you remember, President Barack Obama in the very beginning did his world apology tour. I am sick and tired, and especially from the Oval Office, of our presidents going overseas and throwing this country under the bus. Is there always progress and improvements that we can make as Americans? Absolutely. But let me tell you something. When it comes to compassion, when it comes to fairness, when it comes to opportunity for all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or creed, that is America. It is a social experiment that has never been tried on this planet, and it's never been as successful as it is right here in America. It's getting a little old, whether it's a crappy quarterback or the President of the United States going over and throwing this country under the bus, especially at a time where we are on the precipice of World War III and a disaster over in Iran. And I could go around the globe on the failures of Biden when it comes to foreign policy. Keep in mind, the previous segment, we were listening to Jen Psaki on this Iranian nuclear deal. She brought up Trump pulled us out of it. Yeah, you know what he did? Why? It was a bad deal. And one of the reasons he pulled us out of it was, if you remember, going back over to Syria for a second, which Putin was very intertwined with. It was Putin, Bashar al-Assad. President Barack Obama said the red line is Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, with Putin being involved in it, cannot use chemical weapons. That was the red line. And he did on his people over in Aleppo. And then he tried it again when President Donald Trump, his first 100 days in office, and that was when Trump dropped the Moab, the mother of all bombs. And everything kind of got real quiet in Syria. Trump ran on what a bad deal that Iranian nuclear deal was, and he did back out of it. And if he was president right now, we would not be renegotiating a deal that fast-tracks Iran to the bomb at a time where they are launching missiles at our consulate and negotiating with, of all people, Russia and Vladimir Putin. It's truly unreal, ladies and gentlemen. And, it comes back to, it's just in the DNA of certain people that we put in America, in power in America, that truly do hate America, that truly do hate this country. And that is what you heard from Biden, that we have never achieved this level of equality, of fairness. It doesn't mean that there's not things we can do better. It doesn't mean that in this country's very short history, it hasn't had major missteps, many of which weren't only corrected, but they were corrected and they were made right through the amendment process of the United States Constitution. Most notably slavery. I'm assuming that's where he was going. I mean, it's like a hamster on the wheel, just can't get off of it. How did we get over the horrific days of slavery? Yes, it was in part a civil war, and then it was the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th, freeing the slaves, giving slaves voting rights. That was all through the United States Constitution and the amendment process. Keep in mind, it was the founding fathers that our political leaders love to throw under the bus and classify as a bunch of racists are the ones that put the pieces in place for us to fix some very horrific parts of America's past. And I take offense right now when you have the president going overseas, that is torpedoing the country that he represents, the country that you're framing as being uncompassionate. This is a country that is pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into Ukraine in humanitarian efforts and some limited weaponry. It's not just Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen. Anytime there is a humanitarian crisis around the world, the country that steps up first is America. And my biggest concern with this is what we are teaching our children. And it's not American exceptionalism. If anything, that term is probably offensive to a lot of people out there. What our kids are being indoctrinated with day in, day out is how bad this country is. And whether it is their favorite sports star or even the President of the United States, anybody with a bully pulpit seems to be grasping at the first opportunity to throw this country under the bus. And I think it's time for those that love America, love the founding principles, love the opportunity that this country creates for all Americans, it's time that we stand up and defend that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to turn over to politics in Annapolis with Bryan Sears. Bryan Sears joined us right before the show. This was pre-taped, breaking down legislative session 2022. Bryan was a regular on my radio program. He is a government and political reporter at the Daily Record. Bryan Sears. Right now, we are joined by Bryan Sears, government and political reporter over at the Daily Record, covering Annapolis on what has been a very interesting legislative session, wrapping up on April 11th at midnight. Will be sine die. Good evening, Bryan Sears. How you doing, my friend?
I'm well, thank you. Good evening.
Thanks for taking time to join us. It's been a while. Feels like old times.
A little bit. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, Bryan. A lot I want to get to you here in a fairly short amount of time, but I do want to start with the big news last week, which is the redistricting. This has been working its way through the courts. I've received a lot of emails over this topic. If you can do me a favor and just in lamest terms, because it is a complicated story that I know you've been following down in Annapolis. Take me from the original redistricting, the maps, how it got to the courts, and then what happened in the most simplistic way possible, and then where we are right now. As in Annapolis with the Board of Elections, they have moved several key dates trying to accommodate these court proceedings from when candidates could file till now when the primaries will be. If you could just sort of walk me through this process and where we are right now.
I feel like it's that scene in Airplane, Jimmy, where the guy comes on and he's asked to give an update, and he says, "Well, first the Earth cooled, and then came the dinosaurs," and where we are right now. I mean, to give you a sort of the "you are here" marker, we are in a situation right now where the court has determined that the existing congressional districts that were passed in December during a special session are null and void, essentially violating the state constitution. The judge there said that the 8 districts were drawn in such a way that they minimized Republican voters and made it hard for them to have their voices heard. This is a process that really, I mean, we talk about this happening last fall, but really you probably could trace this back, its genesis, to when Governor Larry Hogan was sworn in 2015 and almost immediately started talking about wanting to have an independent commission that redrew these districts. The governor is the first Republican governor to hold the governor's seat and do redistricting. And so 2015 looks pretty Kreskin-like if you're looking back at it. I think everybody right now, we're anticipating that there's going to be an appeal. If there's not, the legislature has essentially until Wednesday to deliver maps to Judge Battaglia. I can tell you, even if they started working on Saturday, that's a Herculean effort. I think all of us are really expecting that there will be an appeal and that this will be in front of the Court of Appeals, maybe even as early as this week.
So how exactly does this work now? Because you have candidates that legitimately don't know what districts they're running in. We've already moved the primary once. As this works through the courts, it works through the process, the clock keeps on ticking. Do we eventually go back to the maps that we had in the previous election, or do new maps have to be drawn?
I think right now the idea is that new maps will have to be drawn. Jimmy, remember, it hasn't been that long ago that Maryland had September primaries and November general elections. So the idea that if the courts take a little bit of extra time, if this drags out a little bit, right now the primaries are set for July. But in theory, could we see something that's later? I think that's entirely possible, depending on how long the courts take and how long it takes to draw these maps. And remember, this is only the first of 2 lawsuits. The 47 Senate districts and 141 House of Delegates districts are the subject of a second lawsuit that was heard also last week and is awaiting some kind of a ruling from the special magistrate Alan Wilner, who's a former Court of Appeals judge. I think, again, a lot of us are really expecting, because some of the issues here are similar in terms of the equal protections and free speech issues, that what Judge Wilner said might take a minimum of 2 weeks might now take longer, because I think we're probably expecting he's going to wait and see how the Court of Appeals deals with the congressional maps, because some of the issues are overlapping.
We're talking to Bryan Sears from the Daily Record. Bryan, one last question on redistricting, then we'll move on to the legislative session 2022 down in Annapolis. The governor, with all the best of intentions, trying to make this as nonpartisan as possible. Do you believe that there's any buyer's remorse in Annapolis for the angle of attack that was sort of used on the redistricting issue?
Look, I don't. It's hard for me to sort of see into the hearts and minds of other human beings. I don't know that I want to speculate on that. I can tell you that the statement that was issued by the presiding officers, House Speaker Adrian Jones and Senate President Bill Ferguson, they were pretty convinced. They stand by those maps and believe that those maps were legal. I think that that's probably going to be their take all the way through whatever the Court of Appeals does. I'm not terribly certain that I would describe anything yet as buyer's remorse.
Okay. Talking to Bryan Sears, Peter Franchot, obviously the leading candidate, or one of the candidates running on the Democratic side for governor. He's been in the news an awful lot recently, sort of spearheading the 1 month gas tax reprieve, which we are now seeing in effect. The comptroller wanted more. He got 1 month. Also, he's been talking about these survival checks, the funding for both of these. Maryland is sort of an unusual situation right now where we're actually operating in a surplus. For those that may not be aware, where exactly did this surplus come from?
Well, the vast majority of this surplus really sort of stems from the largesse from the federal government. All of the things that we saw that happened in terms of pandemic aid during the course of the last 2 years with the pandemic. And to give you an idea of where we are, I mean, this is my 20th or 21st session in Annapolis. Really, the first time ever in my 2 decades down there where we've talked about a budget surplus, and really what we're talking about is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $6 to $7.5 billion with a B, depending on where you start counting. It's about $7.5 billion if you count the previous year, the current year, and the coming fiscal year. That's almost real money in Annapolis, isn't it? I think there are a lot of ideas about how to spend that money, and a lot of that is still yet to be determined. We've got roughly 3 weeks, a little bit less than 3 weeks, and I think that all of that stuff is still yet to be determined.
Well, the concern I've had with this, Bryan, is we are talking real money. We're talking about we're talking about $7 billion. It is real money. While not technically, is there any concern that this is sort of getting built into a baseline budget moving forward? I mean, you have Marylanders right now that are getting used to gas being 30 cents cheaper than where you're seeing in other states. The comptroller, Peter Franchot, talking about these survival checks, which is money going back into Marylanders' pockets. And on the surface, all these things sound very good, but as we've learned time and time again, once somebody gets used to something being a certain way, it's difficult to go back. Is there any concern that all of a sudden we're looking at continuing these projects, looking into the next legislative session where we don't have Corona dollars, and we're trying to figure out where to come up with another $7-8 billion?
So there's kind of two components here. There's the there's sort of the revenue side of this and the spending side. I can tell you that in the next couple of years, the outlook that we're seeing, it looks like some of this is baked into the bottom line, and we are seeing a resetting of what is likely to be a growth in state revenues. The surpluses that we have now are very much being looked at as one-time surpluses. And so there is a lot of discussion about not wanting to spend that money on ongoing expenses, things that are going to be in perpetuity. Plus, everybody is well aware of the fact that we have some of the biggest payments. If you think about the Kerwin Blueprint for Education as a balloon payment, we are looking at in 24 and fiscal in 2024, 2025, 2026, some of the biggest payments coming due for that. And the idea that, you can't, for example, you can't have the governor's plan to completely eliminate income taxes for retirees because the largest parts of that payment come due at the same time that Kerwin is coming due, and you can't have both. And so I think that there is a lot of awareness down here that the money that we're seeing, the $7 billion, is one-time money.
Talking to Bryan Sears from the Daily Record, covering politics down in Annapolis. The governor coming out last week, Bryan, and endorsing Kelly Schultz running on the Republican side to be the next governor here in the state of Maryland. Governor Hogan still polling very, very well across the board in the state. How significant is his endorsement to Mrs. Schultz?
I think that remains to be seen. I mean, we do know from polls, reputable polls like the Goucher poll, last fall they did a poll that looked at Governor Larry Hogan and what Marylanders might want in their next governor. And the poll showed that in a lot of ways, Maryland voters would be very comfortable with another governor that looked politically, not necessarily a Republican, but the politics-wise looked like Larry Hogan. The difference here, I think, is that Larry Hogan's brand is pretty personal, right? If you go back and look at 2018, there were a lot of incumbent no Republican county executives in Maryland, with the exception of Barry Glassman, survived the 2018 election. This was a very contentious election in Maryland. It was driven a lot by dislike of the president at the time. And, but Larry Hogan survived. And so, people by and large, the governor connects with people and people seem to like him. And the question I think a lot of us have is whether or not that is a brand that is transferable simply by anointing someone the next person, or whether or not voters will look at that anointment as one component of this, but also sort of determine whether or not this person, feels a lot like the last governor felt. We just don't know yet.
And Bryan, two of the big points have been made in Annapolis. I'll let you kind of, peel the onion back a little bit on them individually, but obviously crime and education have been front row center in Annapolis. Baltimore City, even by Baltimore standards, the crime is horrendous. The governor has made a point of sort of interjecting himself into that. And education has taken really a front row center seat. A lot of parents over the last 2 years through virtual learning have had sort of, a bird's eye view of what's going on in the classroom. As how that translates into legislation, what are you seeing in Annapolis?
Look, I mean, we have seen the governor come out with some legislation looking at judicial transparency. He has also brought back legislation that has been unsuccessful the last couple of years that would impose some tougher penalties on criminal and violent criminals who use firearms. I think Annapolis right now is sort of in a stalemate in terms of these things. I mean, we're going to see some of the judicial transparency, I think, probably move. We're seeing that move a little bit in the legislature. I'm not convinced that the governor gets his tougher penalties bill again this year. Education is, I think education is going to be another big issue again in the coming election. We certainly saw that telegraphed in places like Virginia. We saw crime and the issues around police funding as issues in places like Buffalo and in New York City and in Minneapolis, and now we're starting to see it in places like on the West Coast, like in San Francisco. The governor seems to think that those are also going to be potential issues, not just for now, but I think probably bleeding into the election. So I think all of these things are on the table.
Well, look, the funding of police has been a hot topic issue. I mean, over the last year, the narrative nationwide has been defund the police, and now you look at these individual races at the county levels, whether it's Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, you name it, are running this narrative of don't make the counties Baltimore City, and you're seeing sort of that transformation of what is coming out of Annapolis. They're not latching on to the defund the police. It's sort of the pendulum is swinging back to this. We need to support the law enforcement community. It's an interesting quagmire, politically speaking, that we've seen on, where do politicians and legislators stand when it comes to the issue of policing in the state of Maryland.
Yeah, and again, I'll go back to the Goucher poll that came out, I think, in the last month, that identified issues including crime and public safety as a top issue. The economy was a big issue there. No surprise. And education. And I think, interchangeably in any given election year, those three items are always your number one, number two, and number three issues. And so none of this is particularly a surprise. Again, Jimmy, I'd say, everything old is new again when it comes to elections.
And Bryan, lastly, before I let you go, we're a little over 2 weeks before the end of the session in Annapolis. What are you lasered in on as we hit the top of the turn down there?
Well, first of all, I'm not convinced that we're near the end of the session. I mean, it's technically a little bit more than 2 weeks, but you have these redistricting cases that are hanging. And if the courts remand one or both back to the General Assembly to be drawn, and it's done in a way that this gets down there before April 11th, that could extend the session. There's still a number of bills we still have to finish out the budget. The governor has sent, I think we're up to 3 supplemental budgets now, so all of that still needs to be worked out. And we're still looking at things like legalization of recreational cannabis, which I think is one of the biggest ones down there. And the House and the Senate still are in pretty different places, and I'm not sure how that plays out yet.
And I'll just leave it on this, Bryan. Coming back to the redistricting, we have seen significant deadlines have been moved. I brought up February 22nd, I believe, was the deadline to file. That got moved a month. Now the primary has been moved till June, I believe, late June. I believe we're the primary now. We're into July. In July, I apologize. The original primary was June. That's been moved to July. Again, our general election is tied into the national general election, so I would imagine that's going to be a steadfast date. Look, I understand everybody's trying to work with, what's going on here. It's getting worked through the courts. I'm sure everybody would like to have redistricting put to bed. Again, we keep trucking closer to that first Tuesday in November. Does this start to hit the point where there's a major logjam going on when it comes to the way candidates are campaigning and they get their messages out and fundraising? I'm not putting all this on you, but just, the politics of it. It's a domino effect. We're already seeing it, and we're just beginning to wrap up first quarter here.
Well, again, if you go back to 2002, which was the last time the Court of Appeals threw out a redistricting plan, they threw out the state legislative districts, and you had people like Jim Brochin, who had been campaigning for almost a year in a district where he anticipated challenging Andy Harris, who was in the state Senate at the time, and all of a sudden found himself in a district that, in large parts he had not been campaigning in until after the Court of Appeals ruling. I do think that it hinders people from knowing where they're running, and it hinders you from being able to fundraise or even to file because you don't know exactly what district you're going to be in. What I would say is, again, you look at 2002, we had a September primary then. And so September primaries. Linda Lamone was the head of the state elections in 2002. She's still there now. I don't think that September primaries are alien to anyone in Maryland who's been here for more than a cup of coffee. And so while there are some pragmatic things that have to do with candidates and fundraising, the work of elections, I think, is relatively still safe.
I agree. You're right, Bryan. It's not alien. I also don't think it's good business practice when it can be avoided. Bryan, one of the best down in Annapolis. How can people follow you? What's your social media handles and Twitters and Facebooks and all that? I'm learning this as I go, by the way. This is all, you want to talk about alien, that's alien to me. So how can people follow you?
Sure. Easiest way to follow me is at BP Sears on Twitter. And I'm on Facebook again, facebook.com/BP Sears. It's all pretty easy to find me.
And of course, we will attach all those links on our platforms. Bryan, thank you very much for your time. I know you're very busy in Annapolis, and you got beautiful twins you're also taking care of. I would love to get you back after the 11th, after sine die, assuming this doesn't extend past then, which, as you brought up, it very easily could. But I do appreciate your insight, and I'd love to get you back on the program after we get past we get past Sine Die if possible.
I'd like that. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Bryan Sears from the Daily Record. All right, always a pleasure to have Bryan Sears, and I will get him back after the 11th Sine Die, which is at midnight when, in theory, all the legislating needs to be done in Annapolis, although it wouldn't be unprecedented for that to go into a special session, as Bryan had mentioned. I want to come back. We spent a good part of the show last week, talking about Peter Franchot and the gas tax reprieve, if you will, 30 cents being knocked off of the price per gallon of gas here in the state of Maryland, and these survival checks. Both these were funded, ladies and gentlemen, through money that was supposed to go to COVID relief. It's a lot of money. The state budget right now is roughly $43.5 billion. The money that Franchot is so graciously giving back to us, keep in mind, allegedly for one time only, is in the neighborhood of $8 to $9 billion. So let's just break this down to percentages for 1 second. It's basically 20% of the state budget. And the point that I was making to Bryan, and I think it's a valid one, is are you building this into the baseline budget? Meaning, does this go on in perpetuity year after year? Are Marylanders going to expect gas to be cut by 30 cents a gallon? Are they going to expect these survival checks? And make no mistake about it, what Franchot is saying is the state of Maryland has overtaxed. They misread the deal. Marylanders are just paying too much in tax. This doesn't have a damn thing to do with Putin, nationally or at the state level, as much as they want to make him the boogeyman for everything. And it's convenient, by the way, because he's a horrible, bad dude. We got it. Inflation issues, supply chain issues, cost of gas, all this was happening way prior to the invasion in Ukraine. Franchot right now is trying to capitalize on it for political reasons. However, Franchot, in theory, doesn't have to worry past the first Tuesday in November. By then, he'll be governor, or not. Either way, it doesn't really matter. But what happens when all of a sudden, overnight, Marylanders see a 30-cent spike in their gas prices? Nationally, they're talking about giving gas credits, $100. It goes up. It's a means test depending on how many kids you have. One thing this country has proven time and time again is once somebody receives, I'll call it an entitlement for lack of a better word right now, it's really not, by the way, they normally don't like to give it up. What Franchot is doing is he's very graciously letting you keep a little bit more of your money. However, if this continues to move forward, it will be built into the quote-unquote baseline budget, which is what I was asking Bryan Sears. Now, on paper, it may not be built in, but make no mistake about it, it will. Which means, come this time next year, it's just basic math, ladies and gentlemen, the state of Maryland is short by 20%, by $8-9 billion. Keep in mind, what are they spending the money on right now? And I agree with it. I agree we are paying way too much in gas tax. We're paying way too much in estate tax, in booze tax, in cigarette tax, in fees, fines, zoning. There's a million different ways that our money is being transferred from us. So I am not defending the taxes that we pay in Maryland. But what we have right now is tax relief. How do you fund down the road tax relief with increased taxes? I mean, seriously, that's where this eventually ends up. What Peter Franchot has really done, and unknowingly, is started a conversation, or at least we'll start here and see where it goes, on the state being a little more fiscally responsible. Because if we're going to get to keep the money that the comptroller has so generously given back to us in various forms, then we are going to have to become more fiscally restrained. Now, nationally, that's not a conversation starter. You have the vice president going around talking about forgiving debt, and who can't get on board with that? Probably all the people paying for it. Numbers in the trillions, ladies and gentlemen. This at a time when the president is trying to figure out how to reframe Build Back Better, something that came up short several months ago. Trillions of dollars in what? Subsidies, giveaways. Why do we have inflation where it's at right now? Ask any economist. It's not rocket science. Because of spending. Uncontrolled spending has led to hyperinflation. So what is the president talking about? More spending. Significant more spending. On what? On green energy, the new Green Deal. We are putting this debt, we are putting this country into extinction on debt. We are. We have hit the point right now where we really have hit the point of no return. We can either, there's one of two ways to get out of this. We can inflate our way out of it, which we are seeing, or we can flat out just default on it. The United States of America gets a little bit of a pass, ladies and gentlemen, because the world does still operate on the dollar. It trades on the dollar is the benchmark for the world currency. And if that ceases to exist, you're going to see America turn into a third world country real quick. What I hope comes out of all of this with Peter Franchot, and again, I understand the political reasons why he's doing it, but I hope it starts a larger conversation in Maryland right now that is really two-pronged. Number one, we're absolutely being taxed too much. The gas tax is one of the worst abusers of it. It's also one of the most regressive taxes. I don't care if you own a car or you're riding a bus, they're all powered by gas. So it's a regressive tax that affects all Marylanders. And I'll go ahead and run with the Democrats on this. It disproportionately hurts the lower income Marylanders. Also minorities, since they love to wrap everything in those terms. And it's true. It does. And the governor has admitted it. Sorry, the wannabe governor, the comptroller has admitted it. That our gas taxes are too much. Hope it extends past 30 days. Now, he was saying he wanted 90 days. Even those in Annapolis said that's a bridge too far. At that point, we're going to run out of this Corona money. Or maybe they need to stop spending it in other sectors. Speaking of Eye on Annapolis, next week we will be joined by Delegate Dan Cox. Mr. Cox is also running for governor. I had the pleasure of listening to Mr. Cox speak last week, and one of my complaints with the Republican Party here in the state of Maryland is there's not a whole lot of voices of conservatism, and those that we do have don't do a real good job of articulating it. Dan Cox does. He's a voice that I hope the message spreads, and I'm looking forward to talking to him. Again, I had a chance to listen to him, but it'll be a great honor to have Mr. Cox on the program. Next week, ladies and gentlemen, we will be launching JimmyMathisLive.com. It will be the home for all of the prep material. I'll have commentaries there that we use for the Jimmy Mathis Show here at FreeTVBaltimore.com. Also, we will be starting a weekly audio podcast that will live on JimmyMathisLive.com. You'll be able to interact with our segments, find past shows. You'll be able to send us ideas, remarks, all stuff that we will incorporate into both the podcast and the TV show, trying to make it as interactive as possible. I really appreciate all the support that I've already gotten from everybody out there. It's good to be back with you every week. Wish we could have done it sooner, but it's good to be here now. I would appreciate if you can like the program, share the program. This is our distribution right now, so the more that you support it, the more that you share it, support TV Free Baltimore, the more our message will get out. And at the end of the day, this is a town hall. This is us together speaking up and standing for what we believe in this country and here in the state of Maryland, what this state should be. So it is always an honor and a privilege to be here with you every Sunday. I can't wait to get back next week. Everybody have a wonderful week, and I will see you here next Sunday on the Jimmy Mathis Show. Take care.